Hey, everybody. Super excited. We're diving into the future of work with Salesforce's new Agentic Enterprise Index, a groundbreaking report on the use and adoption of agentic technology, top of mind to all of us these days. Joe, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Evan.
Well, thanks for being here. Really excited, and we're going to dive in. But before that, maybe introduce yourself, your team within Salesforce, and what was the big idea behind the report?
So I'm the Chief Digital Officer. Actually, today is my 6-month anniversary. Um, and I lead up the Digital Enterprise Technology Group, which is a bit of a fusion of your classic IT, kind of computers, networks, and all that sort of stuff, combined with us using our own products, and in some cases inventing some products, to make Salesforce the best version of the agentic enterprise we possibly can. The index, I think, is a great thing that we're trying to do now to really just give people some tracking. The agentic stuff is so new, and I think a lot of people are sort of thirsty for data and thirsty for information, and it changes so fast that sometimes it's hard to track things day to day. So we really put our heads together and came up with this index as a way of sort of benchmarking so we can measure progress along the way and really do so in a much more explainable way.
Really helpful, really useful. The report shows tremendous growth in just 6 months, the past 6 months. Are we at an inflection point, a real turning point for enterprise AI, is this just the beginning?
Well, I definitely think it's just the beginning. As far as inflection point goes, I think this curve is going to bend upward. There's no question about it. And sometimes it's hard to tell as you're on the ascent, like how high that curve or how steep that curve is going to be. But it's definitely, we know directionally exactly where it's going. And as you said, last 6 months alone feels like about 6 years. So I think we've now determined that agentics are like a 10-to-1 kind of factor here. But it's really interesting to see. I definitely think that people are getting and settling in, and certainly we are internally settling in to really start to understand what's working very well. And now in our second or third generation of that. And at the same time, discovering new use cases and really, exploring, piloting things like that and trying to figure out where there's other opportunities where we could drive real business value.
Amazing. And Salesforce calls enterprise agentic really a complete business transformation, not just, let's say, traditional automation we've seen for many years. So, what does that look like inside, a typical company these days?
Well, it's interesting to me. I like to think of it where, in all previous sort of technological disruptions or of any sort, I mean, go back to, the cotton gin and things like that, anything that was really a technological disruption, the people were pretty much the same, right? Like it's education gaps. Obviously, people needed to learn about the new technology, but people have the same capability set more or less that we have had for hundreds and hundreds of years. This is a little bit different. When you start to bring agentics in and you now have agents that are working, they have a different skill set. They're really good at certain things, and then they're shockingly not as good at other things that humans are great at. And so when you try to figure out how to make humans and agents work together, you kind of have to go back to first tenets and look at the jobs to be done. And that doesn't necessarily aggregate to, oh, I'm just going to replace this or augment this position on the org chart with an agent. It's actually that the agents are doing a different type of work, and therefore the humans have to do a different type of complementary work as well.
Amazing. And with Agent Force use surging, what kind of patterns are you seeing in companies that are using agents most effectively?
Well, I definitely think that like call it Gen 1. It's tough to refer to generations of multiple that take place in multiple quarters. But I think the first generation of this you saw really centered around customer service use cases. And so in our case, like help.salesforce.com. And I think that makes sense because if you think about it, most places were using a very regimented outsourced data model to handle a lot of these things. So there was already a lot of guardrails and metrics and documentation and things like that to train the humans that were doing that job. When you start to bring agents in, it gives you this rubric that you can at least measure yourself against and say, is the agent doing a better job, worse job, et cetera, than the humans are? And so I think those were the first use cases. They're very, very successful. At this point in time, we've saved over $100 billion in costs on our help side of it. And we've been able to redeploy the humans that were on that side of it to do other things or go deeper in areas that we've always wanted to go deeper, but we just couldn't afford to have a labor force that big to go ahead and do it. So I think that's kind of the first generation. The second generation, we're really now starting to scratch the surface of doing things that like previously were not really even thought of as being automatable. So you really start to get into certain aspects of the sales job, as an example, where the agent can do a whole bunch of follow-up. It can do a whole bunch of lead development and things like that, where, in the past that was exclusively the purview of humans, but we're seeing that there's real value there and, continuing to expand usage. And I think for ourselves, that's the part that I'm most excited about, because it's not just about cost reductions, really about, delivering a much better customer experience or buying experience for the Salesforce customers that are out there.
Incredible. And it looks like travel, retail, financial services are leading the adoption. Interesting. What's driving them ahead of other industries or verticals?
Well, back to the customer service use case, if you look at all of them, they're scale B2C kinds of operations, and they have these massive customer service use cases. And so there's no question that the early momentum there is, based upon the job to be done. These are really good use cases for it. And I think retail is a great example. We have a lot of customers where, there's a lot of conversations that their customers want to have with folks in the retail space. Where's my order? Can I make this change? Things like that. And you're really starting to see like this. I do think you use the word inflection point. I think here, customers are really starting to see the inflection point of just expecting more, like expecting you to be able to do things. And I think having agentics, having support available in multiple languages, having it available 24/7, these are all things that companies generally didn't do in that space unless they were massive global companies. And even then, probably not every language and probably not every day. But now we're just, we're starting to get there where people are just starting to expect that this is the case, that this stuff is going to be available. And I think Agentics plays a huge role in how to scale that from an economic standpoint and still deliver high value from a customer impact standpoint.
Incredible. And speaking of expectations, the report says 94% of consumers pick AI agents when they have the option. That sounds like a real shift in how people expect to interact with brands.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, if you think about it, we're really 2-3 years into this kind of pivot with ChatGPT kind of disrupting things, from an industry standpoint, getting into the consumer zeitgeist. But prior to that, most people, if they got a chat bot, they knew it was a bot, and it was probably not going to be able to handle their particular problem, especially if it was outside of the 80-20 rule or 70-30 rule of things that were highly scripted in the bot. And so it was often a very frustrating experience. And so people generally wanted to talk to a person because they believed the person could help them out. I think, again, ChatGPT changed that. I think the Agentics, Agent Force and things like that, people are now seeing that the agent can help them just as well as the person can in a lot of these instances. And it's not just going to give them these robotic answers. It's going to have empathy. It's going to try to solve their problem. And I think just the overall experience is such that people are now just expecting it, and they're starting to experience starting to have great experiences, and therefore expect even greater experiences. And I liken this to the web revolution, in general, where a lot of the early websites were not that great, but all of a sudden people started to make some really great websites. And when they made really great websites, then other people had to make really great websites to keep up because the customer expectation had just shifted. That transition probably took 5 to 6 years. This transition's like probably 5 to 6 months. It's just happening so much faster.
And fascinating. And speaking of human agent relationships, escalations to human agents rose from 22% to about 32% as AI gets better at routing. So how do you see that balance between the human connection, empathy, and AI efficiency kind of evolving?
Well, it's a really interesting thing because you might look at that statistic and say, well, that's actually a decline, like it's a fail in the sense of the number went, up. So more human presence. but we don't actually see it that way because it's not really all about cost savings. In fact, it's primarily about the customer experience. And what we're actually seeing is if you look at the questions that people are answering, the easy ones are sort of getting picked off by the AI. So the ones that we know about that are common use cases, Agentforce is totally handling. And so it's a little bit of a high pass filter that the ones that the humans get are actually much more complex problems. But the other phenomenon that we're seeing is if you look at the queries that are coming in, people are actually talking to Agentforce in ways they would never talk to a human being. And I think that there's a couple of different variations of it. In some cases, I think, there are questions that people have that they're not sure of. And so sometimes they might feel embarrassed to ask that question to a human, but they have no problem asking the agent, and the agent can give them the right answer to it. So sometimes people have a technical challenge and like, wow, I should know the answer to this. And they feel weird about it, but they are definitely asking the agent more and using it more like ChatGPT in the context of a support window. So we're actually seeing that we're getting more done with each individual customer. And I think that leads to the escalations, because then you wind up in a situation where the agent's talking to somebody and it turns out they really do have an interesting use case that's not super easy to solve. And again, that goes to the human and gets solved by the human then. So I think it's, we're going to start to see this, I suspect, that the escalations may actually go up, but the quality of the experience and the customer satisfaction is also going to go way up.
Fantastic. So it's great to see beyond customer experience, employee experience evolving as well. I see employees are having 35% more back and forth conversations with AI agents. And you indicate actions triggered by agents are up 76% month over month. Are we getting to the point where AI agents feel more like your colleague in the cube down the hall?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, I think, just using it in my own personal life and also in my work life, sometimes you get into a mode. I was just working on a fairly technical problem the other day, and I was having a conversation with an agent, and we were sort of riffing back and forth. And it very much felt like I was sitting there with another engineer that was helping me work this problem. And so, it's not always the case, but I definitely think you're starting to get into that Zen space with these agents in some cases, and you're getting there more frequently and for a longer duration, where it really does feel that you're working with a colleague. I'm always careful to not way over anthropomorphize these agents. They are good at very specific things, but man, sometimes they can have just massive impact as far as time saving goes. Like in this one particular instance, the thing I was trying to do, I would have figured out myself, but it probably would have taken me 3 or 4 hours. And instead I got it done in 30 minutes collaborating with an agent, which is pretty spectacular.
That's fantastic. And despite all this amazing opportunity, there's still a lot of myths and misconceptions, FUD, around scaling AI agents. What are the biggest misconceptions that you see out there in the industry?
Well, I think one of the things that's fascinating to me is I start to see it like self-driving cars. So when you look at it right now, like by and large, self-driving cars are safer. Like autonomous vehicles are definitely safer than humans by a long shot, but they're also held to a much higher bar. And so I think every brand, every customer that we're going through, when you're dealing with this agentic technology, is as much as we put a lot into it to make it much more deterministic. If you crank the knob all the way to full determinism, it sounds like a chatbot. And if you let it be less deterministic, then you sometimes get it to do weird things. And that's just the nature of agentics and the nature of where the technology is at writ large, across the industry. And so, it's interesting with some brands where you're like, okay, well, this thing is here. And they're like, I don't know if that's good enough. And it's like, but it's like 10 times better than your people that are doing that job. And it's like, yeah, but the turning it over to an AI, there's a little apprehension there. And so I think, we're still early in this, while the technology may be accelerating at this clip that's 10x what we've ever seen in one of these other things, it doesn't necessarily mean the people around it are accelerating that fast. So I think every brand, every technologist is trying to find their way about what's the right level of this is good or great, and sort of defining that for themselves. And I think, each brand has its own sort of personality. It wants to read through, and people are trainable to that. So's the AI. But the question is like, what the parameters are acceptable there? And so I think for us, especially, like, I'll give you a case in point example. When we started the Help project, it was giving very accurate answers, but it also didn't really have a lot of empathy. We sort of forgot the soul part of the customer service rep or the help representative at the very beginning. And so people were feeling like, okay, well, this is good, but like, look, I have a problem right here. I have a Sev 1 down. I need to figure this out. And so us figuring out how to make that agent sound more like a human, again, the empathy, I don't want to over anthropomorphize it, but like the feeling of empathy that the agent can engender are things that we worked with. And now people really do feel like, okay, this agent has my back. It's going to try to solve my problem. And the feeling part of it, I think, is just one of those things that, the digital on off and feeling are not necessarily two things that go hand in hand. And so I think that's a big part of this, is just the evolution of companies, the evolution of what does great look like, and trying new things and figuring it out. So I expect you are going to see a bunch of FUD around it and a bunch of things like that. But when you find the use case and it rings through and you get it dialed in, then you know it. Like it's one of those things, when you see it, and you're like, yep, that is impactful. That's actually moving my business forward. That's helping my customers.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love the autonomous driving analogy. My first Waymo ride in San Francisco was terrifying. My 10th, it felt as smooth as butter. I think I took a nap in the back seat. So
yeah, totally.
it really is something you have to experience firsthand. Speaking of which, behind the scenes at Salesforce, how are you using insights from the index to improve agent force and maybe also help customers get better real results?
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, data is absolutely the fuel that fires this agentic revolution, without question. Having qualitative data, observability, understanding what these agents are doing, using that as part of continuous improvement loops, that's the way you get to great. It's very much like a direct-to-consumer product where there's a lot of testing, a lot of experimentation, a lot of analysis that's being done to just continuously improve these things. And the good news is the rate at which they're continuously improving is also accelerating. We're getting better at figuring out how to tune them and better at figuring out how to deploy them, but it is so data-driven, exceptionally data-driven and disciplined sort of exercise. It's just absolutely really important. And obviously you see the data then rolled up into the index. Obviously we have more data than just what's in the index, but you see the index as sort of a manifestation of that kind of like obsession about instrumentation, that obsession about observability. Because otherwise it's just really difficult to figure out what these agents are doing unless you're that relentless about it. And it's a big part of what we built into Agentforce.
Fantastic. So a lot of experts from places like Harvard and Stanford are saying businesses will need to redesign and rethink and reskill for this wave that's approaching. What do you think about how leaders need to prevent a divide between the AI haves and the have-nots? Sort of new digital divide?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's real. I suspect you, and I certainly know for myself, we're of an age where we remember where not everybody knew how to use a computer or not everybody knew how to use a smartphone. I remember teaching my parents how to text as an example, which is now their preferred mechanism of communication with me because they actually understand that it works really well and I can get back to them more readily. And that divide has always existed, right? Like there's always a leading edge and a trailing edge of these things. But I do think that in the fullness of time, that it is more of a reskilling thing than it is this massive displacement. Like people are going to figure out how to use these agents. People know how to Google things. I remember talking to my wife once, and she asked me something, and this is a while back, and she's like, well, you should Google it because you're better at Google than I am. And it's like, how could you be better at Google? It's Google, and I think it's going to be the same thing with these AIs. Yeah, people will have more aptitude. Some people will actually develop the agents. But as far as like being able to use them, I think it's really important that companies, invest the time to do the enablement and the training for their employees. But I also think that's, one of the things at Salesforce that we excel at, and one of the reasons that we're so focused on these enterprise use cases, because I also think a big part of that enablement is companies having the tools and having something like Salesforce probably already in-house. And, the vast majority of these companies, us bringing the enablement with us when we bring Agentforce, we can not just give them the technology, we can also give them the best practices. And that customer zero use case, that is really like the absolute catalyzing part of my job, is to make sure that like we're not just figuring these things out, but we're figuring them out in a way that's explainable so that we can go out and evangelize to our customers, hey, this is what worked for us. You may want to try it for you.
Oh, well said. Indeed, some companies are seeing, customer experience metrics and net promoter scores up by 200% with AI agents. It's really phenomenal, but yet we all experience those places where, CX is falling short in our everyday lives. Where are they falling short and why? How can we help them?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is, first and foremost for me is accessibility. Like I just in my personal life bought a piece of furniture, and then I had to deal with the company, and it was sort of like like Fred Flintstone slide down the back of the dinosaur at 6 o'clock on a Friday, and I was like, wait, what do I do? Like I can't talk to anybody until Monday. And I think, a lot of it is that companies have practical financial constraints, and, people are not inexpensive, and having off-hour support, off-hours, especially multilingual support, is a very expensive proposition. So I think part of it is using something like Agentforce, we can really just extend that window to the point where, like, if you were closed, the bar of what the agent has to be able to do is a good place to start because you were closed. So your customers had nothing to do. Once you start to get those use cases and use it as a bit of a test bed, and I like the after hours use case for folks that didn't have after hours before, is you really are able to develop these things. And then you start to build confidence with the technology, you build confidence with the agent. Then you're like, okay, well, now maybe I can have that agent take over other parts of the day or augment my team, or maybe I should rethink the way I'm doing IVR altogether. Like maybe there isn't an IVR. Maybe you just talk to the agent, and then the agent can route you if it feels like it can't solve your problem. So I think really figuring out how to get on the journey is the biggest thing that we can help companies do. A lot of people are it's the paralysis by how do I even get started? And that's one of the reasons that we continue to work, and we'll have some really great stuff to talk about at Dreamforce about really easing the onboarding. Where people can really just get started with it and start using the technology and understanding it. And then, like I said, build confidence, and then, transform. It's sort of, those are the stages that I see people go through repeatedly, and I've seen us go through internally.
Amazing. Speaking of Dreamforce, you have your hands full over the next few weeks. What else are you excited about over the upcoming weeks and months?
Well, I'm really excited about these sales use cases, honestly. Not just because obviously, it's kind of in the title of the company. It's an important thing to us, but also just the nature of the technology and the nature of what these agents are starting to do. You're really starting to take a glimpse of what the future is. It's one of those things that sometimes, you see a technology and you're like, oh yeah, that's where it's going. That's definitely going to happen. And I think we're really starting to see that now on the sales side, where you're like, wow, this is going to be impactful. And I think the thing about AI is it's been so rapid. Like, so this agentic revolution has happened so quickly. I actually think that some people are like, it's overhyped. I actually think the hype is proportional. It just may have been a little bit too much of a leading wave of it. And so we're now starting to get to the point where we're seeing, especially like I said, internally, I'm seeing some of these sales use cases. And I'm like, yeah, that's going to live up to the hype. No question. It's just going to take a little bit of time to catch up.
Well said. Well, that was quite a mic drop moment. Thanks so much, Joe, for joining. And as always, really insightful conversation. Appreciate the time.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for listening, watching, and sharing this episode. Take care.